We've had some distance from the launch of Age of Calamity, and though the discourse mildly reignited after Christmas when many people finished the game for the first time after opening it on Christmas morning, things have mostly died down. We've had plenty of time to think about the game, its ending, and its characters. Many people have made videos about it. I myself have made 3. I'll link to one in the corner if you'd like to watch. The duration of Age of Calamity discussion has, I think, outlasted many people's expectations. In fact, I saw many people wishing that we'd all collectively just move on from the game weeks before we finally did. All the same, Age of Calamity dialogue is mostly over. Naturally, people have started looking forward in time to Breath of the Wild 2 again, and being at this weird crossroads where people still have Age of Calamity in mind, while discussions about Breath of the Wild 2 are starting to pick back up, it has me thinking about how the games might relate. Not necessarily in terms of story, I made a whole video about that, but I'm curious if Breath of the Wild 2 is going to take inspiration from Age of Calamity. This very well might not be the case if Breath of the Wild 2 started development before Age of Calamity, which could be a possibility. But if it started development after, or even if they were developed in parallel, it wouldn't surprise me if Aonuma and the Zelda team looked over to Age of Calamity and thought, hey, that's a good idea. I'm gonna swipe that for our game. And indeed, I think there's quite a lot in Age of Calamity that Breath of the Wild 2 could use for inspiration. Let's talk about it. And hey, if you like these kind of videos, or if you've seen a video of mine in the past that you've liked, why don't you consider liking and subscribing? We're getting so close to 3,000 subscribers. So the first thing I want to talk about does relate to story. It's still hotly debated whether or not Age of Calamity is canon, but if it does turn out to be canon like I think it will, it actually offers something very exciting for Breath of the Wild 2, and that's the fact that the champion descendants now know how to pilot the divine beasts. A lot of this really does come down to how they decide to deal with the descendants in Breath of the Wild 2. Like we mentioned in our video discussing how Breath of the Wild 2 could relate to Age of Calamity in terms of story, there are a few different ways that the descendants could be handled in regards to their journey to the past. Perhaps they completely forgot it, or perhaps it's just a foggy thing that they only have vague recollections of. But if they do remember their time in the past, that's a big deal because they learn how to pilot the divine beasts in Age of Calamity. We very explicitly see Sidon piloting Vah Ruta during the push to retake Aquila Citadel, and in a side mission, it's very clearly labeled that Teba is in control of Vah Meadow. This could be the case with the other 2 descendants as well, and I just missed it, but they at the very least are also seen piloting the divine beasts in tandem with the other champions. And if they retain their memories when returning to their own timeline, this means they come back with the knowledge on how to pilot the divine beasts. This could obviously have a huge impact on the story of Breath of the Wild 2. After how much people have complained about the divine beasts as dungeons, I don't think we'll be diving back into them in Breath of the Wild 2, at least not in any meaningful way. Which means I don't think that we'll see the divine beasts get re-corrupted or anything like that, for the sake of avoiding repetition if anything else. And if each beast has a pilot that knows how to use it, that could mean Link and Zelda have some very powerful allies in the fight against the new evil. Perhaps the divine beasts lose power after their use in Breath of the Wild, and they need to be repowered with crystals that Link and Zelda venture into temples for. There are a lot of fun ideas that divine beasts with pilots offer to Breath of the Wild 2, and it'll be interesting to see if this ends up being the case. Another small story thing. Age of Calamity offers us much better and more interesting designs for the Blights. If they do come back in any meaningful way, I really hope that they use their Age of Calamity models over the Breath of the Wild ones. Let's move away from the story though. This point of inspiration I actually think might be the most controversial on this list, and that's the fact that I think Age of Calamity shows that bringing in actual music isn't going to destroy Breath of the Wild's atmosphere. It was actually hugely satisfying for me to tromp around familiar Breath of the Wild landscapes, but with some truly fantastic music in the background. My views on Breath of the Wild's choice to focus on ambience is that I do agree with people that the ambience worked for the game. For the first 40 hours or so, that is. After that, the sound of wind and the soft jingles that play in the overworld got pretty boring for me, and Breath of the Wild now holds the record as the only Zelda game that I play with a podcast on in the background. So I would love to see Breath of the Wild follow Age of Calamity's footsteps and give us some actual music in the overworld. Maybe this is asking too much, but it would even be awesome to have a toggleable setting between ambience-focused music and an actual overworld theme. Feel free to tear me apart for this in the comments, but I said what I said. Let's keep this controversy train going. One of my other biggest problems with Breath of the Wild is the weapon degradation system. I know the mere mention that I don't think it's a gameplay revolution is likely to set many of you off, but it's probably my least favorite part of Breath of the Wild. I know all the common defenses. Maybe this can get its own video one day, but I'll go through a couple of them now and why they don't change my mind. People often say it forces you to get creative and try new weapons. And this is true, it does force you to switch weapons, which does force you to get creative, but that's only really true if you're fighting low-end enemies. Because of Breath of the Wild's choice to make stronger enemies by taking existing ones and just giving them more health, that supposed choice quickly disappears. If I run into a tough enemy and my good sword breaks, I'm not going to be going through my inventory and deciding which of these weapons is going to be best against the enemy. It won't matter because it's going to take half my inventory to kill him anyways. So the next 15 minutes isn't spent using creative tactics, it's spent breaking sticks and traveler's swords over a Lionel's head until it finally dies. That isn't choice, it's just monotony. I know a lot of you are just going to say, well, you just need to get better at dodging and parrying. And like, yeah, that's fair enough. But if the primary way I'm going to be doing damage to the enemy is through flurry rushes, then why does it matter what weapon I'm using? Why can't you just let me pick what weapon I'm using? Not to mention that it not only shatters my realism, but it makes getting really good weapons way less exciting than it should be. When I find a new Royal Claymore, I don't get happy, I just think, cool, this will make it so the next bag of hit points I run into takes a reasonable amount of time instead of 15 minutes. Then it'll break and it'll be gone. Eventually I get the Master Sword, and at that point I'm not even enticed to vary my weapon choice at all. The Master Sword is the only one I can get with any frequency that doesn't break after a single tough enemy, so when it runs out of energy, I just put the game down for 10 minutes and go do something else. I'm sure plenty of you are going crazy at what I just said, but I make no apologies. I can't stand the weapon degradation system as it is currently. It makes Breath of the Wild's early game really fun, exciting, and dynamic, but it comes close to ruining the late game for me. However, because I know plenty of people do like it, I'd love to see Nintendo take the blacksmith from Age of Calamity and bring it over to Breath of the Wild 2. I think this could be a great in-between. I don't think that every weapon should be repairable because an inventory full of broken items is probably more annoying than the current system. But what if they carried over the weapon upgrade system, where two weapons of the same type can be combined into a stronger weapon? And any weapon that is upgraded does not disappear when it breaks and can instead be repaired at a blacksmith. And they could take the resources used to complete side missions from Age of Calamity and apply that to the Breath of the Wild 2 blacksmith. Perhaps there's a certain resource, probably a mineral or maybe a monster part, that can harden your weapon and make it last longer. Not only would this satisfy people like me who complain about the weapons breaking too easy, but people who like the breakable weapons can opt to just not apply the oil, and having to venture out and find rare monster parts needed to harden your weapon encourages exploration, which is the spirit of Breath of the Wild. I think it's the best of both worlds. What else? Well, let's tackle another one of my issues with Breath of the Wild. Enemy variety. The enemies in Breath of the Wild are dynamic and in-depth and endlessly fun to fight. They are vibrant and often intelligent, and I have no qualms with saying that the enemies in Breath of the Wild are the best in the series. But the trade-off is that there just aren't very many. Sure, a literal count of the different types of enemies is going to end up pretty high and within range of the other games of the series, but most of them are just different colored versions of the same enemy. Some of the dungeons in previous games have a wider variety of enemies than the entirety of Breath of the Wild. This certainly isn't a deal breaker by any means, because like I said, the enemies that are in the game are utterly phenomenal to fight, but it does get old. And this is an area that Breath of the Wild 2 can make huge advancements. And one of the ways that it can do this is by ripping off the excellent idea of elemental enemies from Age of Calamity. This was one of my favorite additions to Age of Calamity, different enemies being seemingly enchanted with different elements. And while in Age of Calamity it sort of just serves as a rock paper scissors system for your wands, Breath of the Wild could elevate it to something really exciting. Think about it. Breath of the Wild's chemistry set design focuses so heavily already on the elements. Think of shooting electric arrows into the water to stun an enemy, for example. The enemies themselves becoming elemental would gel so incredibly well with Breath of the Wild's experimental systems. Elemental wizarobes already exist, but they don't really do what I'm imagining. Imagine flying from a vantage point above a camp of bokoblins, led by a fire moblin, then dropping a bomb into the middle of them. Whereas normally at this point you'd need to come out of your parachute because you've lost altitude. Now you can steer in the direction of the fire moblin and use the steam that it naturally creates to raise yourself back in the air. Or imagine that you're trying to fight an ice Lynel, so you track it to where it dwells, and then nearby you build 5 or 6 fire pits in a circle. Then you engage the ice Lynel and lure it back to your pit of campfires, and the heat weakens it, giving you an easier fight and rewarding your clever thinking. Or imagine sneaking into a moblin camp while they're sleeping and laying metal weapons all over the place, so when you wake them and the electric moblin oversurges, all the metal weapons lying around become electrically charged and do damage to the bokoblins caught between them. I really do think this has insane potential. Whereas elemental enemies are just a system to dissuade button mashing in Age of Calamity, they could absolutely be game changers in Breath of the Wild 2. Another thing that I wish Breath of the Wild 2 would take from Age of Calamity is the idea of Link fighting with allies. I understand that Breath of the Wild was meant to be a solitary, often lonely experience, and I do think that was an excellent decision, but I also think that being able to bring a companion with you would be an excellent addition. I don't think it would detract from the experience at all, and I can say that with some confidence because you already sort of can. If you scan the Wolf Link amiibo, you can journey around with Wolf Link, who will help you fight and keep you company. I made a whole video about how I think Breath of the Wild 2 should let Link have a dog, essentially just porting over the Wolf Link system and taking away the amiibo exclusivity, allowing it to apply to different breeds of dogs. But after Age of Calamity, I think it would be really cool if Link was able to have humanoid companions as well. They'd follow you and fight with you, and when they take too much damage, they give you a line about being too beat up and needing to go home, and they fade away back to whatever city you recruited them from. People have been wishing for Zelda to accompany Link in some form or fashion during the actual game, and I think this would be a great way to do that. Zelda can be brought along at any time just by talking to her in Kakariko Village, or at Link's house in Hiteno if Zelink is finally made canon. And when she comes with you, she stays by your side until she takes enough damage that she needs to go back and rest. This could also apply to Teba, Riju, Sidon, and Yunobo, who would be happy to accompany Link until they take too much damage. And we have a good idea of what this could look like. Let me zoom in on Age of Calamity enough that the HUD is hidden, and it looks like Breath of the Wild, but with Link traveling with a companion. With the exception of Princess Zelda, the way they could fight could be pretty similar to how we see them in Age of Calamity, though obviously to a much less extreme degree. I don't know, I really love the idea of Link being able to bring a companion with him. I don't think that Wolf Link killed the tone of Breath of the Wild, and I don't think a humanoid companion would either. But even aside from that, Breath of the Wild 2 is a separate game, and I don't think it needs to strictly adhere to the tenets of isolation and loneliness that the first game strove to emulate. A less lonely experience might be a good way to differentiate the second game from the first. The last thing I want to talk about is Age of Calamity's focus on a present, active narrative. One of my biggest problems with Breath of the Wild, as I've discussed in the past, is the fact that the interesting story happens prior to the actual events of the game. The events we experience during Breath of the Wild itself aren't actually all that interesting. The beginning and the end of the game are interesting, as Link wakes up to Zelda's disembodied voice and meets the ghost of King Rome, and later frees Zelda from her eternal conflict with Ganon, together overlooking a freed Hyrule. But everything in between is just kind of uninteresting. The modern story of Breath of the Wild gets by completely on the strength of its characters, because what you're actually doing is rote, even by Zelda standards. Travel to the city, meet the leader, meet the descendant, or in Riju's case do both at once, help them with some task, assault the divine beast with the help of the descendant, and then have a nice conversation with the spirit of the champion. None of that is really exciting. Don't get me wrong, it makes for some fun gameplay, and again the characters are fantastic, but the events themselves aren't really that interesting. When people refer to interesting plot points in Breath of the Wild, they're almost always referring to something that happens during a memory, because the memories that show what happened leading up to Hyrule's defeat is where the actual interesting story is, and none of it is interactive. And sure enough, when Age of Calamity came out and we get to play these events that we merely saw during flashbacks, it is a hell of a lot more engaging, at least for me. I understand disliking or even hating the twist at the end, but up until that point, I feel like it's a pretty fair argument to say that Age of Calamity's story was far more engaging and interesting than the story in Breath of the Wild. Not just because the plot points themselves were more interesting than the plot points in Breath of the Wild, but because we're actually experiencing the story as it's happening, and getting to play the cool things we see, instead of just watching them play out in a cutscene. In Breath of the Wild, the interesting story happens before the game. In Age of Calamity, the game is the interesting story. And I hope that's what they do in Breath of the Wild 2. Really, I suppose this isn't so much Breath of the Wild 2 being inspired by Age of Calamity as it is Zelda going back to its old style of storytelling, because in most of the games, the plot is experienced in the present instead of the past. What I do hope that Breath of the Wild 2 narratively takes from specifically Age of Calamity though is the heavier focus on story in general. I think this is something that most people will agree with, especially considering the popularity of Twilight Princess, which was probably the most narrative game in the series, maybe tied with Skyward Sword. But in particular, I hope that Breath of the Wild 2 embraces Age of Calamity's heavy use of cutscenes. Age of Calamity, possibly more than most games, struck a nice balance between showing cool stuff in the cutscenes and not making you wish that you were just playing instead of watching. In Breath of the Wild, seeing Link stand over the corpses of 24 monsters leaves me wishing that I could have experienced that myself. Whereas in Age of Calamity, the game shows the lead up to these moments and then gives over control to you. And the far greater amount of cutscenes in Age of Calamity allows us to really get to know the characters in a way that Breath of the Wild had to relegate to text in their diaries because of its sparse amount of cutscenes. Instead of reading about how the king is apologetic, we get to see him apologize. Instead of hearing about how Urbosa saved the village, we get to see it happen. A lot of wonderful moments that were relegated to being read about in creating a champion returned for cutscenes in Age of Calamity, and seeing them was so much better. And I hope that Breath of the Wild 2 embraces the idea of a stronger narrative focus. It doesn't need to be tied to the same tenets of open world design that stifled the first game's story. We have our open world Zelda that lets you do any mission in any order. Its sequel is free to try and forge its own identity, and one of the ways it can do that is by bringing a stronger focus on story. And I hope that Age of Calamity showed that substantial amounts of well-written, and for the most part convincingly voiced cutscenes, very much have a place in Breath of the Wild 2. Since the jump to 3D, Zelda has never been shy about dumping exposition on you, and I gotta say, after seeing a Zelda story told almost exclusively through cutscenes, I'm not eager to return to clicking through unvoiced text boxes for minutes at a time. And that's it. These are the things that I'd like to see taken from Age of Calamity and supplanted into Breath of the Wild 2. How about you guys? What do you think about these desires and wants of mine? Do you strongly disagree with any of them, or do you have your own list of things that you'd like to see make the jump? Perhaps you're keen to forget that Age of Calamity happened, period, and you'd like the series to move on without adopting any of the things that were introduced. Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe out there. Watch out for malice-infested mice and spooky green hands, but if you get put in a tight spot, call your descendants to save you at the last moment, because it's dangerous to go alone.